So in the work I'm going to be presenting today, now this is work from a series of studies that investigated learning, and then more recently I've been looking at generalization of L1, L2 incongruent collocations. One of the main goals here is to also look at multi-word units as a window to explore co-activation and language regulation in the second language. So one goal is to understand how the role of L1 influence under different learning conditions, how it might allow to exploit, how we might be able to exploit this co-activation to learners' advantage. So I'm going to be presenting here mostly work from 3 studies. The first one is a behavioral study, and the other 2 are based on ERP data. So the first 2 focus more on the learning side of things and processing to some extent, and then the last one focuses mostly on generalization. And then hopefully we can, I'd love to hear about, of course, look forward to your comments and questions during the Q&A, and where, the next steps for this type of work might get us as a community into. So let me start with an example. I guess I don't need to say much about multi-word units in this particular group, but just to start with a cinematic example, and I guess at this time of the year, a winter-themed one seemed appropriate. To get in the shoes of a second learner for a moment, right? If we read a movie review like this one here about The Revenant, says for The Revenant, Iñárritu opted to shoot the movie in the order in which the audience will see it, adding cost and complexity to an already ambitious undertaking. What both native and non-native speakers might notice here is there's words of very high frequency in English, right? And some of these are a little less frequent. And then you have words like Revenant and Iñárritu that are very low frequency in English. But it's often overlooked by learners, the fact that there's, of course, these co-occurrences that's in the input, such as the order in which ambitious undertaking or to shoot the movie. And I'm going to be focusing on specifically verb-noun collocations, as in this example, as in shoot the movie. So I'll be referring to this as collocations, but I'm specifically going to be discussing work on verb-noun phrases like this one. So as I said, I'm probably preaching to the choir in this particular group, but just to highlight a couple of relevant points. We know that knowledge of multi-word units is important here for both non-native as well as first language speakers, as this improves the production of fluent and native-like speech, or speech as expected by interlocutors, and this of course facilitates processing. And at least in some usage-based approaches, this is proposed to allow for the development of grammatical knowledge, right? So the idea being that you first need to acquire the basic multi-word building blocks upon which to generalize your linguistic experience. And so, but the fact is, despite these important points, what recent work has found is that more experience with a second language doesn't necessarily lead to an increased production or use of conventional multi-word units. And there's many other factors we could focus on, but one that's been particularly well researched, and it's perhaps the most influential one I'll be focusing on today, is the congruency between the first and the second language. So let me start with a couple of examples to illustrate. So for a verb-noun phrase like write an article, say for a first language speaker of Spanish, this really doesn't present much of a challenge. It's a phrase that's perfectly congruent with their first language, right, which has a literal word-by-word equivalent. But if we looked at a different phrase, such as to shoot the movie, as in the example I gave before, you can immediately see how the Spanish equivalent is non-congruent and has a very different verb choice. So what we know from previous work is that incongruency leads to costs in processing, even after these collocations are well known by learners or second language speakers. but production hasn't been researched to such a large extent, at least until recently. So if we consider the production side of things, again, in the case of congruent collocations, this is an easy task for learners where they might mostly just rely on their first language. But in the case of incongruent collocations, what we would consider is to produce a target verb noun sequence such as shoot a movie. Selecting the target actually requires doing so over the more entrenched and highly active competitor from the first language, right? So in other words, selecting shoot doesn't only require remembering this connection, this link between shoot and movie, but the idea is that this would require inhibiting the more automatic choice based on the more entrenched links in the first language or the dominant language. So I want to highlight here then that there's two important aspects to learning here. So we often focus on the perhaps memory side of things, right? Where this is a problem where learners need to learn new combinations, how to put words together in a novel way. And definitely that's a fundamental aspect. But then I want to highlight that there's also a regulation cost here. The issue being that learners need to be able to activate or regulate the competition from the more dominant language as they're trying to produce speech that has been recently acquired or is less automatized in the second language. So this is actually an idea that has been highlighted in recent years, in particular Bogolsky and colleagues, building on a large trajectory of studies highlighting the role of co-activation and cross-language competition, also interpreted some interesting findings where learners trying to acquire vocabulary in a new language were more successful doing so via their first language. And so an idea they propose is that the superiority effect through first language mediated learning was not only due to the fact that learners could create direct mappings between the L1 and the new language, but also they suggested that this afforded an opportunity for learners to engage in language regulation. That is, by directly activating their first language, they were also able to train and regulating competition across the two languages as a potentially important skill in bilingualism. So let me jump into the first study that's directly building off this idea and exploring the suggestion that there might be a desirable difficulty in training lexical learning and specifically collocations in a second language in conditions where interference from the first language may be particularly prominent or high. So what we actually know from production data in previous work is that learners may actually know the target collocations, but they often produce the wrong word choices. In no small part, this can be traced back to the first language influence, right? So the idea is that learners may actually succeed in learning the right expressions, but retrieval may be ineffective or even entirely blocked due to the problem of lack of regulation of this competition across the two languages. So the idea we explored here, I did with my former dissertation advisor, Julie Ducius, was can practice conditions that induce first language interference improve learning by allowing to develop first language regulation? So let me give you a concrete example of how this might play out in terms of what our predictions might be. If conditions where a learner is exposed to higher competition or interference from the first language, we might expect that initially there should be costs, right? And we might be able to measure this through slower reaction times and trying to make the correct lexical choices and in the face of interference. But with additional practice through more training, we might expect that this might actually lead to the opposite results. That is to, by allowing learners to engage in training this skill, it might become more efficient. And we should be able to measure this in faster, more efficient reaction times and increased accuracy. If they're really being able to tame or decrease the competition or regulate the competition from the first language. So to test this idea, we tested 40 native speakers of Spanish who were intermediate learners of English in Spain. And learners were assigned to two groups that I'll be describing in a moment. One was what I'll call the interference group, and the other one was the unrelated group. They were matched across a number of proficiency and cognitive measures that I won't go into too much detail here, but I'm happy to go into the nitty-gritty details later if anyone has any questions about those. And so they first completed the first, they did a first session where these tasks were administered, and these we also were particularly interested in making sure that this was not about learning new words, that they would also actually know the individual words, but it was the new associations between them that they would be learning. So we checked this in a first session, and then in a second session, they completed a familiarization task and practice, and they completed additional practice in 2 more sessions the following week. So for the study phase, this familiarization phase, they were exposed to the Spanish phrases and then the target collocations to be learned in English, and they were asked to repeat them out loud and type them as a way to become familiarized with them and try to learn them, and they got immediate feedback. And so just to give you an example of the materials, again, in this example of shoot a movie, that was one of the incongruent collocations they had to learn. Just to remind you, this is the Spanish equivalent, and as you can see, the verb is incongruent, very different from what we would use in English. Now, importantly, the same verb was also part of some of the other items they were familiarized with. So this verb was part of another congruent collocation. And so the idea is that any of these verbs might be potential candidates for selection during training. So they then completed this main training task. And what this looks like is, and they saw a sequence of screens. In the first screen and the second screen, they saw 2 verbs. Any of these could be, in principle, a candidate for selection. And then on the third screen, they saw a noun that allowed them to choose the correct verb based on what they had been familiarized with. So they were asked to produce out loud the correct verb, and then after the response, they got immediate feedback. So what you can notice here is that of course, shoot is the correct verb here, and drive is an unrelated distractor. So it's not semantically plausible, or it's not related to movie or shoot. So it should be a fairly easy task to reject this distractor, right? And that is what half of the learners saw. Now, what the other group of learners saw was different distractors. You can see here, this is what would be actually a plausible candidate based on their knowledge of their first language. So this is an L1 related distractor. And the idea is that this should be a much harder choice to make, to the extent that this would seem like a valid choice based on the first language knowledge. So this was the only difference really between these 2 conditions. All the training looked the same for both groups, but we manipulated what distractor they would be seeing and would need to suppress in order to make the correct choice. So I'll be referring to these as the unrelated condition and the L1 interference condition. And so to test their learning, we administered immediate tests after the first and the last practice session, and also delayed tests particularly at the end of training. I'm somewhat simplifying here the results for the sake of time, but I'm happy to go into more detail into this. So what did the results show here? So let's go back for a moment to that initial prediction. So we hypothesized that the interference condition, we should expect here to see an initial cost, but if learners are in fact being able to better develop the skill of inhibiting the competing first language, then we might see that this trend actually eventually leads to more efficient selection in terms of accuracy and timing. So first, I'd like to show you some reaction time data. And this is reaction time data during selection of the correct verb during the first training session. And what you can see here is the trajectory of the two groups. So the blue line, the L1 related distractor, the interference, this is the interference group that was exposed to L1 related distractors during training. And just as expected, what we see is at the beginning of training, they were significantly slower than the other group. But now, as training progressed, you can see how they actually became quite more efficient, such that by the end of the training session, which lasted about 20 minutes, they were significantly faster already than the baseline group. Now, the unrelated group, they started being faster, and they do get a little faster with as would be expected with practice, but really not so much more efficient by the end of training. So what's important to consider here is these were the people with the easier task at hand, right? So rejecting the unrelated distractors should actually be fairly easy, and still they were not able to become as efficient as the other group. I have other data I'm not plotting here, but by the end of the last session, actually, the L1 related distractor group was consistently faster from beginning to end relative to the other group. So that supports the first prediction in terms of the increased efficiency in the selection of the target verbs in the multi-word in the collocations. Now, ultimately, of course, we care about accuracy, and so timing in itself is not so relevant if learners are not making the correct choices. So, of course, we wanted to look at post-tests of learning. And what we see here is that after the first training session, after the training was completed, and even 1 week later, it is the group that had the L1 related distractors that is consistently and significantly outperforming the other group. So this also supported that second hypothesis. And so together, these two types of data support the idea that training L1 regulation and training collocations and conditions that induced competition from the native language might actually pose a desirable difficulty. Now, we could ask, and there's other behavioral data that I won't be showing today that can speak to this idea, but the main question here as well is as we were claiming that this might be due to inhibition of the first language counterparts. So to address this question, I conducted a follow-up study using event-related potentials. So in this case, the idea is that, okay, we're seeing these results and behavior, and that's perhaps one of the main goals here, but also in trying to understand what really is driving this advantage. A main goal here was to identify what specific mechanisms are associated with these advantages in this desirably difficult condition. So there's two main questions I'll focus on here today. The first one is, do the conditions that induced interference actually provide any evidence of enhanced L1 inhibition in ERPs? And if that's the case, is that evidence of inhibition predictive of recall rates and behavior in the post-test that we administered? So essentially, this study is building off the first one, and the methods that I will describe briefly are pretty much the same, but the main difference is that we also used ERPs while conducting this study. So I'm assuming some mixed background of the audience. So I will just very briefly mention, in case for those of you who may be less familiar with ERPs, during a task like this, in this technique, the continuous EEG signal is recorded as participants are completing a task and, in this case, exposed to linguistic stimuli. And so I'm going to be highlighting a couple of ERP components, which are the peaks and valleys that you see in that graph that are time blocked to the presentation of an event, in this case, the linguistic stimuli. But the best known example, or the best known, the most widely studied component in the psycholinguistic ERP literature is, of course, the N400, which is sensitive, highly sensitive to the context in which a word appears. So if we have something like the pizza was too hot to, of course, you now are expecting a specific verb and you're expecting eat, but not cry, right? So, and this is exactly what the event-related potentials show. So in this case, we see that cry is not expected. It's difficult to access in this context because it's not predictable. And so the upward going, negative going peak in voltage here for cry reflects that difficulty in an N400 component, indicating that that verb was relatively harder to access relative to eat and even drink, which is semantically related, even if not a good choice in that context. So based on this, we had a clear prediction here, right, that incongruent collocations based on previous work on processing should elicit a processing cost relative to the congruent collocations, all else being equal. So for the unrelated condition, we would expect precisely to see an N400 component indicating a greater cost in accessing collocations, or in this case, the noun following a verb, where the verb serves as the preceding context, where a noun may be more or less expected. So the N400 is one main focus here, but there's another component that we also studied in a previous experiment where during lexical selection for multi-word units, we might expect that in incongruent collocations or in cases where enhanced monitoring during a response is required, we may expect to see a right frontal effect, which indeed indicates a greater cost or uncertainty during response selection. And this is a later component that might emerge around 800 milliseconds. So this was for the L1 interference condition, though. Going back to the first study, we had a different prediction here. So if in this case, what is happening is, as we interpreted in the behavioral data, that the verbs that are congruent with the first language but are not adequate for the second language are being inhibited, then we might see that it is precisely these verbs that become harder to access. In other words, if these are being inhibited, then we might see a cost, an N400, for the congruent collocations where that these verbs are part of. All right, so so then the prediction for the second question is clear. If ERPs are in fact showing inhibition, then we expect that the amount of inhibition should predict or be correlated with the recall activity in testing. All right, so to test these ideas, in this case, we reverse the direction of the language, the dominant and less dominant language. So we tested first language speakers of English learning Spanish at Penn State in the US. And the materials were adapted for the different direction in language dominance, but were otherwise really similar. And just to give you another example, in addition to shooting scenes, in this case, we had to play jokes, but they were trying to learn the Spanish equivalent for that, which is gastar bromas, where the verb literally translates as spend. Everything else really was the same as in the first study I described in terms of the materials. The main difference was in how the task itself was conducted. We recorded the EEG, and so in this case we had participants press buttons. It's usually not a great idea to have participants speak to the extent that it can be avoided as you're recording EEG to avoid other artifacts in the signal. So here they're seeing a verb displayed to the left or to the right of the screen, and they would press a button to select the correct verb. So here we have literally play and spend, and then jokes. And here they should not select play, which is congruent with English, but not appropriate for the Spanish target phrase, and they would choose spend. So the idea is that now play has become inhibited. And then this verb will, however, come up again during the task and should be harder to access, to process. All right, so what did the results show? So let's first focus on the unrelated group. What we found in the unrelated group was that, as predicted, you see this red line for the incongruent collocations. So in this first time window for the N400, you see that as expected, incongruent collocations are eliciting a cost during processing, as would be predicted also based on previous data from behavioral studies. Now, when we look at the L1 interference group, we see something really different. So you also see an N400, but you see how that line is reversed now. So what we're seeing is that it is the distractors that are congruent with the first language, the ones that are now even harder to process than the verbs of congruent collocations or the nouns of congruent collocations. This reverse N400, what's indicating is precisely that congruent collocations were harder to process. That is the ones that are just like the native language. And this is exactly what the prediction for an inhibited first language should look like. And I also want to highlight a second time window here. So you may also notice that there's a difference in the ERPs of the two groups. Now, what we're seeing here is the right frontal effect that we also elicited in a previous study, which is related or indicative of difficulty in selecting a response. And interestingly, this was present in the group with the easy distractor, but not in the group, in the L1 interference group. So the what this suggests then is that learners may be actually taking two different pathways towards selecting the correct responses. That is, because the learners in the L1 interference group are inhibiting the distractor from the first language, this inhibition acted instead of the monitoring processes indexed by the ERPs in the unrelated group. So I propose here that there's two different neurophysiological mechanisms at play, and just based on the type of distractors that learners are being exposed to during the task. So if this is true, if each of them are taking a different, relying on a different mechanism for a successful selection, then we should see that at the individual level, more of the inhibition effect should be inversely correlated with the right frontal effect, indexing greater monitoring during selection, and that's exactly what correlation showed. So there was an inverse correlation between these two components. So we find evidence for inhibition. Then, is this related to performance in any way? So is this something where we can tie the brain activity to actual performance in a subsequent test after training? So based on this, we were now able then to sort of calculate an individual index for inhibition. What is the direction and the magnitude of the effect for a given individual? And precisely what we found here is a significant correlation between the level of inhibition, such that greater inhibition of the L1 congruent words was significantly predicted greater recall in post-tests. So just to summarize the main findings in this study here, then I found that increasing the difficulty of practice by manipulating the distractor improved second language learning rates and recall in post-tests, and elicited different neurophysiological pathways. But importantly, it was only the inhibition of the first language as indexed in that flipped N400 that was directly associated with a greater ability to retrieve the target L2 collocations. Okay, so so far so good, I hope. I'm going to shift gears now for a moment for the third study, because now I'm going to be asking a slightly different question. So far I've been focusing on the effects that co-activation may have in a context where learners are trying to select the appropriate lexical choices and based on novel multi-word units in a second language. So this third study is builds off the findings from the first two studies, but what's apparent from these two experiments is that the cost of learning incongruent collocations is very steep. So a question that has both theoretical and practical implications then is if and how the knowledge of these previously acquired second language collocations can be generalized to new items. So to give a concrete example of this, having learned an incongruent collocation like shoot a movie or rodar una película, how well are then learners able to generalize this and comprehend related items such as shooting a trilogy, a scene, a TV show, a documentary, and so on. So so what do we know about generalization in the first language? What we know about first language generalization is that this is something learners do all the time, or no, native first language speakers do all the time, but that this is largely based on similarity, right? So to take probably a familiar example, if we focus on this drive adjective construction, speakers of English hear all the time things like "it drives me crazy" or "it drives me mad." But in recent decades, we've also seen innovations where people will say things like "it drives me insane" or "out of my mind" or even "bonkers" or "bananas," right? So these are all acceptable utterances, but you can't really go too far with that generalization, right? So other utterances that would not be acceptable would be things like "it drives me happy" or "uncomfortable" or "she drives him intelligent" or even "sane." So clearly all the accepted innovations have a high degree of similarity with the more prototypical and highly frequent use of the construction, as in crazy and mad. But then there's, of course, the story is a bit more complicated for bilingual speakers, right? So then there's potentially more than one pathway they could take. So the first pathway then, based on first language generalization, we might expect that there could be within language analogy where similarity to a highly frequent prototypical exemplar would allow for generalization. But there's also a potential alternative in second language speakers, right? So it might be that if there's enough integration between the incongruent collocations in the second language and the existing intralexical links in the first language, it might be that learners can take advantage of what they already know in the first language. So this may not be entirely intuitive because incongruent collocations are by definition, well, non-overlapping with first language representations. But there's at least some recent work by Ottunowska and colleagues that suggests that there's actually a greater level of integration between incongruent units in DL1 and DL2 than might be expected. So to test this idea, then I computed two measures related to each of these that would allow to test each of these two potential pathways. So one would be then if there's within language similarization, we could take a known multi-word unit, such as shoot a scene, and a new one, which has a related noun like episode, and we can quantify the similarity between episode and scene. And I can go into details into how that was done if there's interest in that. But for now, I'll just highlight that there's this is a quantifiable similarity that we can exploit. If generalization, however, relies more on knowledge of the first language collocations, then a second measure we can use is the collocational strength or the collocational status of the first language equivalents for these collocations, right? So in this case, here you see valid collocations across languages, but we can have control units where shoot a meeting is not something that's related to scene in terms of meeting and scene not being similar semantically, but then also this is not a collocation, and so we have negative values for both measures here. All right, so and these measures are somewhat correlated, but they're weakly correlated, so they're both each is contributing something different to our analysis. So these measures will allow us to then potentially disentangle the contributions of similarity within the same language or similarity to first language collocations during processing. But they should also look quite different in terms of the timing in processing these novel collocations. So what we know from previous work, recent work in the first language, say that relative to processing a conventional collocation, processing novel collocations that are semantically interpretable has been found to elicit late positive component, this LPC that we see in the graph here. So these LPC is present in novel targets that are interpretable, such as order the protein relative to order hamburger, but not in phrases that would be hard to actually interpret semantically or understand, such as order the dominion. On the other hand, as we've just seen before, familiar and unfamiliar collocations by themselves will also elicit differences in the N400 time window, right? Such as that order hamburger is relatively much easier to process than order the stress. All right, so then this also allows us to test these two hypotheses in the sense that if generalization follows a time course similar to the first language generalization, we might expect a late positive component might be elicited during processing of novel collocations. If, on the other hand, learners are able to exploit the knowledge from the first language, where they already know the collocations, they wouldn't need to make a new generalization, right? They can just process them on the spot. So this is not news to them, at least based on the first language. In this case, we might expect that, only in this case, we might expect an earlier time course of processing than we would find in first language speakers. So to test this idea, I tested learners that completed the same type of procedure I described in the previous study. With EG, they completed 3 practice sessions, and only after that they saw a generalization task where they were presented with new multi-word units, and they were asked to provide acceptability judgments, whether this was acceptable or not. Okay, what did the results show? First, in behavior, what the results showed was that they were very well able to tease apart the acceptable and non-acceptable multi-word units that they were just seeing for the first time. What linear mixed regression analysis showed was that in behavioral responses, both measures, both the similarity within language measure and the first language counterpart collocational strength measure, both seem to contribute to these ratings. This was complemented by the ERP data. So just to remind you, based on that ERP data, we might expect two different time courses for generalization. Only if the first language is coming into play, we might see an earlier time course of processing than we see in first language speakers when they're generalizing their knowledge to novel utterances. Okay, what the results of ERP showed was, as you can see here, this is around 400 time window. Learners were showing a time course of processing that was congruent with the idea that it is the first language that is mediating processing of these novel multi-word units where the verbs are incongruent with the first language. What the analysis showed that was indicated that there was an effect only of the L1 collocational strength measure on these ERPs, but similarity did not play a role. So what you may have noticed now is that then there's a seeming discrepancy between the behavioral results and the ERP data. So how can we reconcile these two findings if similarity only played a role in the behavioral responses? What's important to consider here is that behavioral responses were actually much lower, as would be expected, than brain activity, and they averaged about 1,600 milliseconds, so more than a second and a half. So what seems to occur here is the first language knowledge very rapidly was able to mediate processing of these novel collocations, and that's what the ERPs are reflecting. Then only after lexical access, when learners are reflecting on the acceptability of these novel multi-word units they're reading, they can reflect and draw on their knowledge of both their first and their second language, and this is what the behavioral measure is showing. So in this case, it's both types of data are complement each other in allowing us to describe the time course of processing and the contributions from the first and the second language. So I know I already hit the 40-minute mark, so I'll just conclude with a couple of brief points. So what these three studies showed is, I think what I'd like to highlight is these are two sides of the same coin. So there's, in both cases, we see co-activation, but in a context of language lexical selection and production, we see that there's a need to regulate activation during learning, and we saw contexts where that better allow learners to develop the required skills for successful second language use. And the mechanisms are quite different, however, in generalization during processing, where any knowledge that's available to learners, where in the first or the second language here, is, at least in this context, helping them opportunistically capitalize on that knowledge to process the input that's available to them in the best manner possible. So one, of course, there's many directions this could go in the future, and one possibility is that also here explicit mappings from the L1 to the L2 during training may have enhanced those cross-linguistic mappings. So interesting directions, I think, for the future would be to examine how, for example, generalization might play out in context of incidental learning, where learners are not so directly mapping novel second language multi-word units to their knowledge in the first language. And of course, there's other contexts where we might look at generalization, where there's not even a clear first language equivalent, but rather there might be multi-word units that are only existing, or constructions that are specific entirely to the second language. Well, so I look forward to your comments, but thank you. I want to thank and acknowledge funding agencies and institutions that supported this work, as well as my co-author of the first study, Julie Ducius, and research assistants and other colleagues that have provided very valuable input. And thank you so much for your attention. I really look forward to your comments and questions. Okay, I think I'll stop.